Now I'm working on drawing a mug, a regular ordinary coffee mug, in diagrammatic perspective. And to start off, I've gone through and created a box, establishing planes on the top and the bottom that appear to converge back to a vanishing point on our horizon line. And then I've dashed in the transparent edges that would be obscured by the front planes. Now the next step is to create the ellipses for the opening and the base. And I'm working without a ruler, just as a rule. I like to keep it a little looser. So I've taken and found an X to create midpoints front and back, and then along the side here, establishing those points of intersection at those little dots, just to keep this moving along at the same rate here. Do the same thing to the bottom. Now we don't want to absolutely trust our hand if we aren't using a ruler. So you want to keep an eye on how horizontal something appears to be, and if you're a little bit off, make the correction. So I'm going to put the dot there, dot back there. So that's the starting point for drawing the ellipses. We end up, for me, usually creating a little bit of an arc to establish the idea that my ellipse is only going to touch this bounding planar box on those points, that if it hugs the edge of that box too much, you're going to end up with a flattened ellipse. It looks a little lopsided. And generally speaking, I like to think about the entire ellipse, even on the base where I can't see the bottom of the mug. That way I ensure that the proportions are accurate. So I end up spinning this around a bit so that I feel comfortable with a certain direction. Whether you're lefty or righty, you may go the opposite way. And it's not to say that that's perfect yet, but it's a starting point. Alright. Okay, I've tightened up the ellipses a little bit. They're never going to be a machine quality perfect because you're drawing this by hand, but you do the best you can. And so I'm essentially just going to complete the cylinder here. We take midpoint, 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 and connect with a vertical. And since I already have two verticals describing the transparent construction box, you pretty much just run it between them and just ensure that you're hitting those points. And so what you want to be aware of as you're evaluating whether this is working for you or not is the transition from that vertical should flow smoothly into the ellipse here, that there's no corners along the joint, that it just moves and flows right into it. Likewise up here, it moves and just flows right into it. That nothing comes to a point, that your ellipses don't end up having corners like that. So we're trying to avoid that and ensure that the thing goes around the figure. Alright, so the next step is to start thinking about the handle. I'm not going to worry about the thickness of the mug yet. I want to ensure that everything else is working. And so the handle is attached through the center of the mug. Otherwise it would fall off and it wouldn't balance correctly. So one of the things we look at is this center line, which represents from the midpoint to midpoint of the ellipse. That I'm going to come down from the top a certain direction or certain dimension based on how much distance I see between the handle on the mug and the top of the lip here. So I'm looking at that distance, and likewise looking at the distance from this point, projecting up a little bit. And so from those ideas, that thinking here, we're going to project a plane. So a piece of paper like this can represent the plane for you. In your mind, you're pulling the handle away from the center of that handle, or center of that cylinder, and creating, we're going to create a box for it. So in bringing this plane forward and away, I'm thinking about the handle, again, connecting through the middle here. So if you can't perceive that perspective yet, then something that's helpful is to actually lay the pencil over top of this, put it back into position where you're looking at your viewpoint, lay that angle in there so that you can get a pretty accurate measure to what that angle needs to be. And I'm working very loose. Trying to pull that angle out. And it sometimes is going to be similar to one of these X angles, which may end up confusing. So make sure that you're pretty clear with what you're looking at as best as you can. And I'm really trying to think about these things as extensions, that they pull forward much longer than they need to, so that I can perceive this as converging as a plane. In perspective, those parallel edges recede and converge on our horizon line to a different vanishing point than what was established up here. So I've got a plane kind of protruding forward. I need to figure out where this vertical measure will kind of cut it off and represent the edge of the handle, or the widest point of the handle. And so that's a sighting measure. Compare the distance between the cylinder here, looking at the negative space in the handle. Compare this distance to the widest point relative to something else that you've already measured and are relatively happy with. So I'm looking at a distance relative to the height here of the top ellipse and pulling that away just a little bit further than where I was initially guesstimating. And so this is a little bit of a work in progress. This next step will be to create around that plane sort of a folded piece of paper that connects to the box, connects to the cylinder. Now within the handle plane, we're thinking about it attaching to the cylinder. So we have to think about it, at least at the beginning here, also wrapping. So I've taken a little arc around the dashed line, and I'm going to encourage a straight vertical drop here. And put in a little bit of an arc. So we're trying to think about this wrapping around the cylinder as much as possible. And so this dashed line represents the midpoint for my handle at this point. So I end up thinking about bringing, again, it's a flat plane. I'm going to treat this again kind of simplistic here. Whatever I've set up there, I can bring up here with a vertical mark. So hopefully you can start to see that as a plane, another plane, and we get to the midpoint here, and there is some perspective involved going this direction. And if you can't see that perspective, again, you can move your handle, you can move your mug into position, put something underneath, pretty much lined up with where that side plane of the handle attaching here would be going, and you end up making sure that these are converging. So carrying them through way more than you need to ensure that that idea pulls those forms together. So this is a very geometric idea. Again, I'm working by hand, so nothing's going to be perfect. Make the corrections that you need to clarify something. Okay, so I have a flat plane that bends around as if it's a folded piece of paper, and this is where you start to assess whether or not this box is correct proportionally to what you're seeing on the mug itself as you look at it. So by all means, you think about corrections as needed. I think where I'm looking at things, I'm okay. Maybe want this a little bit further over. And I could see this coming in a little bit. So I'll make that change and I'll come back and bring this a little bit more into focus. Alright, I've made the adjustment to the box for the handle. Before I start to make any curves here, similar to with the interior ellipse within the box here, I had these midpoints sort of figured out so I knew where they would just touch. I do want to establish that kind of idea here as well, that it creates a widest point in the curvature, so that handle is just going to touch those moments there. It's going to curve away, and it's really useful on another mug handle. Where's the widest point? How does that relate? This is a pretty classic mug that I'm drawing here, not as ornate as this one is, but anything that you can find that would have reference points in terms of symmetry, we want to make note of those relationships here. So wherever the curve goes high in the front here, it needs to go high on the backside in perspective, so those relationships need to line up. So relatively speaking, you need to get to know your subject and make sure that things are clarified in there. So a few notations, and we obviously know that there's some thickness here. You could certainly go in and introduce that thickness to the box handle if you felt the need to establish that, but I don't generally think it's necessary. So the way the handle attaches, depending upon the mug handle, will be a little less boxy, much more rounded, so it is important that you kind of observe what's naturally happening. Is there a curvature? Even though I was going with the form here, with the flat paper structure here, if I build this little vertical away from that center point, I can make sure that I go to that height here, so it creates some roundness, some loft to this mug handle. It stays, relatively flat here, not a ton of lift in this point. And then it goes out to the widest point out here. And what's kind of interesting is this outer edge here becomes the outer edge here, rather than being visibly pulled all the way through as if it's one side in front, one side in back. We see these kind of line up. So I'm going to leave it where it is for the moment. Come down here. This center dashed line here, dotted line, it's important again in creating that high point. And you can think of this as having that dimension here, as if it's going up and over, going up and then over. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to be very conscious of how much space exists between which I can delineate a little bit darker here for reference, this side of the cylinder and the space between the handle. And likewise, as I'm looking now into a more specific area here, we're going to be looking very much at the negative space, that space between the handle and I'm going to keep assessing what that space is doing. I'm seeing it come much closer to that dashed line there, so I'm going to take this thickness here all the way out, and it ends up really compressing the thickness there. So as far as tricks go within here, it really is so much about seeing this space, this shaded in area, and rendering that and drawing that so that you do have that ability to draw what you see as empty space, as well as drawing the handle itself. Alright, so one last note here, and then I'll finish it up and then show the final result, is the kind of implied line that would be the lowest point here and the lowest point on the handle. I find that is a really useful evaluation to be making. So I'm looking at the angle coming away from the handle here, curving up, and this is where that transition is interesting on a handle. If I tighten this up there, we have this thickness that's coming around from up here, and I would treat this as a soft edge, not as sharply defined as that inner line, because it is a little rounded. That ends up connecting down with the bottom edge. You can even blur it with your finger a little bit. And from that point, this lower contour becomes part of the back edge. So you get this kind of back becomes front, and this upper height here, this upper edge, becomes the lower edge. Alright, so I'm going to tighten this up, show the end result. Alright, so I've tightened it as far as I would with a line drawing. Now again, I've tried to create a little bit of difference or distinction between rounded edges, this inner edge here, which would actually vary in dimension as well a little bit more, and get pretty narrow right in here, But for the moment, it's a good place to be at, where you'd end up transferring this drawing onto another piece of paper to tighten it up for shading, watercolor, whatever you might end up doing with a drawing like this. So it's also taken a moment to create a little bit of dimension to the thickness of the mug. It's a little bit more challenging to create the volume here without some shading, the gradient that happens on the inside of the cylinder. But something that is noticeable is that the thickness of the lip here is more visible here and here, the outer sides, which end up being not foreshortened. So as you're looking across that thickness here, you're condensing it as you're viewing it back into space. So the front and back edges end up being just a little bit narrower, and you find that thickness a little bit greater on the outside edges. Now, something that probably could be adjusted even still is this sharpness of this edge here, which is a really strong overlap of what's happening in here, and as it goes around, becomes not an overlap anymore, but more like a rounded edge as the handle is created. So this edge maybe is a little darker and sharper than it really needs to be, just to emphasize that thickness. So those could be a little softer, a little grayer than what you're using on this front edge. That also adds the atmospheric perspective that the darker lines are going to advance in front. I've taken pretty sharp edge here. This is a relatively dark edge, but I've also lessened the pressure right as it overlaps behind the handle so that it allows the handle to come forward. So I could sharpen that moment right there up and lessen the contrast of the edge back there just a little bit to help promote that advancement of the handle as a figure. Alright, so thank you for watching. My name's Steve Hughes. I work at Primary Hughes Illustration.